Welcome to the Fundraising Elevator, where we're all headed up. This podcast is a production of Swaim Strategies, a consulting firm dedicated to nonprofit fundraising events. We're coming to you today from the studios of the AV department. Please welcome our hosts, Kristen Steele and Samantha Swaim.
Hello, and welcome to the Fundraising Elevator, where we're all headed up. These days, it seems like we're living in a little bit of real change happening in the nonprofit sector in real time. And I think it's a really important conversation to be having right now about abundance, which is what we're going to talk about today. We hear often reports of giving is down. We hear often reports of changes happening in the sector, but I think there's a real opportunity for us when we start to look toward what is the good. And so today we're looking at the abundance. Our guest is Mary Crogan, the Vice President of Brand Marketing at Bloomerang. We love our partners at Bloomerang, and if you've been around us, you know Bloomerang. They're one of our podcast sponsors, a go-to giving platform for nonprofits, and a tool we genuinely recommend for fundraising, donor management, volunteer management, and events. But more than the product, we love the people at Bloomerang. They show up as real thought partners in this sector, and Mary herself is someone who has spent her career at the intersection of creativity and strategy, leading marketing for global organizations and growing companies alike. She knows how to build something that lasts and make it mean something. So what better human to join us in talking about abundance? Mary, I'm so glad you're with us. Welcome.
Thank you. That's a really warm welcome. I appreciate it. I'm happy to be here.
Well, we're so glad to have you here. And before we dive into the topic at hand, because I think it's a really big, juicy topic, I just wanted to ask big picture, you're working with thousands of organizations across the country. What are you seeing in the sector right now? 2026 is an evolution for sure. So what are kind of those trends or highlights that you would sort of call out right now?
Yeah, that's a great starting point. I think, the biggest shift we're seeing right now is that the gap between need and traditional funding is actually widening. It's getting even bigger. And, across the country, government support, continues to pull back while demand is continuing to increase. So nonprofits are being asked to do more, often with fewer predictable resources. That's nothing new, but it's become even more extreme, I guess. And it's easy to really look at that circumstance and see a crisis, right? And in many ways, it is a really challenging moment right now for the nonprofit sector. But I think what is important is that generosity itself hasn't disappeared, and I know we're going to talk about that today. But I think what is changing is where the support is coming from and how people want to engage. So we're seeing more giving shift toward individuals and private capital and more participatory forms of philanthropy, right? So for nonprofits, they're in a tough spot. This moment is both a pressure test and I think a pivot point. And, for those organizations that are, willing to adapt, it's actually one of the biggest opportunities the sector has probably seen in a very long time. Yep. And it's one where they can unlock new kinds of support and build deeper relationships more so than ever before.
Yeah, I think I love that term pressure test because I think that is exactly what we're seeing. I also like your phrase predictable resources and sort of those shifting and question marks happening, creating this pressure. I think it provides an opportunity for people to move forward in two mindsets, either with abundance or with scarcity. And I think sometimes we think we're operating in one lane,
right?
But we're not, right? And so let's just sort of start at the top for folks. Can you talk about those differences in mindset? What does an abundance mindset look like, and what does a scarcity mindset look like for folks?
Yeah, for sure. And it really is sort of an inflection point or a fork in the road in many ways, which path you choose to pursue from a mindset standpoint. It's really about how nonprofit leaders think about resources, right, and opportunity. There are two sort of basic ways that people look at the world, approach the world. There's the scarcity mindset, which assumes resources are really limited and shrinking. And I think we see common expressions of that in the nonprofit space, in terms of thinking that donors don't have any discretionary income right now. They're tapped out. There's too much competition for funding. We're competing against other nonprofits and other causes, and we're fighting over the same shrinking pool of donors. And that scarcity mindset, it's understandable for the reasons I mentioned a moment ago, but the research shows, and it's important to recognize this, that when you're in that mindset, it changes how people behave.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, you have the abundance mindset, which, that assumes, it assumes resources and opportunity can grow through relationships and creativity, and innovative thinking and approaches to problems. So instead of asking, is there enough giving to go around, a nonprofit leader that has that abundance point of view is asking, well, how do we unlock more generosity, right? So the abundance thinking, that mindset doesn't ignore the very real challenges, but it just expands the field of possibility.
Yeah, and in some ways requires folks to actively hold the tension of the pool and the water we're all sort of being asked to swim in, just in terms of the noise that's happening around us, to really dig deep and remain connected to what the potential is. And that is no easy task, but also is how you counter the noise.
Well, you mentioned, Kristen, you just said potential. Mary said potential earlier as well. And I think that, Mary, you also said opportunity, which I think those words to me bring hope and bring a sense of possibility, right? You also said there's a lot of research. Can you dive a little bit into that research and what the research shows?
Yeah, absolutely. The research is actually really interesting, and there's quite a bit of it. So I'll just talk about a couple of different studies. So there are some research was done by economists, both at Princeton and Harvard, and they found that when people feel scarcity, and whether it's in the context of scarcity of time or money or resources, they feel really constrained. And it actually reduces mental bandwidth and your decision-making abilities. The studies have proven this. The research has shown that scarcity can really narrow your focus. So you're focused just on the short-term problem in front of you. It increases sort of a reactive decision-making model. And believe it or not, the study showed that it can reduce your cognitive capacity by the equivalent of losing 13 IQ points. So if you're in that mindset and you're constantly struggling against that sort of scarcity point of view, it's really limiting. And this phenomenon actually has a name. It's called tunneling. And for nonprofit leaders, it can often result in, a short-term focus on transactional moments in fundraising, short-term campaigns instead of a broader, longer-term view and strategy, and can really hinder and create reluctance when it comes to trying new things and experimenting or innovating. And then on the other hand, you have the growth mindset research, right? So there's a woman from Stanford, her name is Carol Dweck, and her work revealed that people who believe in opportunities and abilities and possibility can expand and take more strategic risks. They can innovate more often, and they can persist through setbacks. And if there's any sector that has felt setbacks and the impact of that, it's the nonprofit space, right? And then finally, there's another study out of UNC that shows that it's called positive psychology research. And it shows that if you're in a positive mindset or emotional state, it does the opposite of scarcity. It actually broadens your cognitive thinking. It increases your creativity. and your problem solving skills, and actually leads to greater collaboration. So there's definitely a yin and yang here between the two mindsets, and the research that's been done, I think, does a really good job of painting that picture.
Well, and what's fascinating about this is that donors feel these.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think as organizations and leadership within organizations, we're like, oh, this is just contained to our four walls. We've got to work on it internally. And it's like, you do. And also, donors feel all of that. So when we look at donor motivations to want to be a part of something successful, and all we're getting is
crisis.
Oh my God, the house is on fire. If we don't hit this number, we're closing. It's like, I am going to back away because I don't know what's happening and it doesn't feel successful in many ways.
Well, I love just the yin and yang positioning.
Absolutely.
That we can either be tunneling, struggling, lacking innovation, dropping our IQ, or we can be taking risk, innovating, resisting, increasing our emotional creativity, increasing our IQ, collaboration. Those are all like, I mean, yin and yang is a great descriptor. It's like the very opposite ways.
Yep.
And when you initiated our conversation where you talked about we're in this moment of time right now where organizations are being kind of what I would call sandwiched. It's like you have that moment where the need is increasing and then the reliable or predictable funding is also decreasing. Yeah. And I hope that people can live in that lane of innovation and trying and taking risk and thinking collaboratively and creatively. And so I love that Bloomerang is leaning so much into abundance. It's just, there's so much opportunity there.
100%. And I just want to add one little note, I'm talking about this in sort of clinical terms. In no way do I want to diminish how hard it is to make that shift from that scarcity mindset to one of abundance. But it is something that as leadership, you have to kind of make that conscious choice. We're going to shift our thinking. We have to. But I fully recognize how hard that can be. And just wanted to state that.
Yeah, I think it's like rolling the boulder.
Yeah.
I think as a concept, we go, well, of course.
Of course we want
abundance. Yes. What are some of the practical advantages for organizations living in that space?
Yeah, it literally expands how you, like we said, look at opportunity, and organizations and the leadership that's growth oriented, they're significantly more likely to experiment and adopt new strategies. And by doing that, they're achieving greater impact. They're achieving the outsized fundraising goals and objectives that they set, right? So it creates energy, right? And you mentioned it a moment ago. In terms of when you're communicating and engaging with your supporters, they want to hear uplifting stories. They want to see positivity. They want to see that energy. And that's really important. But it's also important for your teams internally, right? To feel that positive energy, that morale, that motivation. It opens up creativity within, like you said, within your four walls. It opens up people's approach to problem solving and how do we get from point A to point C or whatever it might be. And it really starts to shift the conversations from, how do we compete for limited dollars to how do we unlock more generosity? Because it's out there. And I think the other advantage, and this is probably even most important, is it helps create greater resilience, especially during those uncertain times, which is especially important for nonprofits because they're constantly navigating change in that uncertain environment. So it doesn't just change strategy. It having that mindset and the advantage, it actually changes the outcomes.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I think that the nonprofit sector as a whole is, when we live in a world that's very built off of capitalism, we have this phrase, the nonprofit sector, which to me just like positions us from a scarcity mindset. But why do you think fundraisers and sort of leadership teams, why do you think folks move towards scarcity versus abundance?
It's a great question. I think scarcity thinking is common in nonprofits because it's rooted in those very real pressures we were just talking about, right? They're constantly navigating that rising demand, budget challenges, the uncertainty. So when you're operating in that environment day in and day out, it's natural to focus on what's limited. It's a very natural human response to those circumstances. But I also think the sector has been shaped, frankly, by the stories it tells itself. There's a steady drumbeat of messages and narratives around, donor fatigue is rising, giving is declining, there's too much competition, as I was saying before. And while there's truth in parts of that, those messages, repeated over time can start to feel like the full picture. The challenge is that scarcity thinking can become self-reinforcing. It can lead organizations, like we were discussing, focus on that short term, those transactional strategies. How do we avoid risk? How do we pull back on innovation? When those are exactly the things that they need to be doing to grow. So the organizations that are able to take a step back and say, yes, this is a challenging environment, but where is the opportunity? Those are the ones that start to break out of the cycle and see, a very different set of possibilities.
Well, I'm excited to talk about how to break out of that cycle and see those different sets of possibilities, because I think that when you've been living in the scarcity mindset, it is hard to figure out kind of how to move toward an abundance mindset. And you've been very intentionally and effectively making that shift. So we're going to take a short break. And when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about abundance. We'll be right back.
Great.
Ready to take your fundraising to the next level? Need to get unstuck in your event planning? Now's your chance to connect directly with the experts behind the Fundraising Elevator. Book a one-on-one consulting session with Sam for strategic planning and fundraising strategy, with Kristen for your programming and storytelling, or Mary for your registration and data tools. They're here to provide you personalized answers to all your event questions. Don't wait. Raise more at your next fundraising event. Book your session today at swaimstrategies.com. You can also find the link in our show notes.
Welcome back. We're talking about abundance with Mary Crogan of Bloomerang. Mary, there is a lot of noise out there right now about generosity going away. And sometimes it's hard to know if that's what they'd like us to think or if that's what's actually happening. From where you sit, is that true? Is generosity going away?
Yeah, no. Generosity hasn't gone away. I think what is happening, there's a fundamental shift, though, in the form and shape that it takes. And there, again, we've been talking about research. There's been research, and if you look at donor data, we're seeing strong signals of giving capacity and intent. 70% of Americans have given on a recurring basis. 57% of Americans report high trust in nonprofits. We're seeing donor-advised funds continue to grow pretty rapidly, both in terms of, total dollars granted, but also the number of accounts. And that's showing that people are actively setting aside money intended for giving, even if the timing of donations is shifting. Even with online giving, right? It remains elevated compared to pre-2020 levels, even after the sort of pandemic surge normalized, which I think is a strong indication that digital behavior has permanently expanded access to giving. And we're seeing volunteer rates are rebounding, and in some segments they're actually increasing, especially amongst younger supporters. And there's another great stat. I love this one. 75% of Americans say they would donate $1,000 or more if they won the lottery tomorrow. So there is a spirit of generosity here in the United States is alive and well. People still want to give. They simply engage differently than they have in the past or relative to a previous generation, if we're talking about younger donors. And I think this aligns really well with sort of this broader industry insight that, generosity endures even as all the giving patterns start to shift and evolve in meaningful ways.
Well, you mentioned younger donors. I want to dive into that because I think that there's a lot of talk right now in the sector about the fact that we're experiencing generational wealth shift, right? The large shift, the largest in U.S. history, from a boomer generation to a Gen X generation. How are you seeing generational shifts in giving, or how are younger donors giving?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. In terms of the wealth transfer. And I think a lot of nonprofits recognize this. But my dad's giving habits are, and the causes he has supported through his lifetime are very different than mine. So yes, there's a shift in terms of dollars and wealth. But that doesn't guarantee that the behaviors are going to remain the same when it comes to how those dollars continue to be donated and dispersed. So that's one piece. When it comes to younger donors, that change is probably one of the biggest drivers of perceived scarcity because people feel or believe that younger donors are not engaged and they're not willing to give. And the truth is quite the opposite.
Yep.
What they're doing, what this shift is doing is expanding the definition of generosity. So we look at Gen Z and millennials. So Gen Z, the research shows that they are twice as likely as baby boomers to give after a positive interaction. They're highly motivated by community and shared values, and they're strongly influenced by peer recommendations and social proof. So that's our youngest segment. The millennials, that's where my two kids sit. So I've seen this firsthand. 43% of millennials prioritize value alignment with a nonprofit and the cause that they support. And they're more motivated by an emotional connection and recognition of their support. And I can say that, that's my daughter, that she fits that profile really well. And they often give in response to, a real-time event or real-time stories of impact. So the younger generations, they have unique characteristics, but what they have in common is that they participate in generosity differently, right? They're donating, but they're also volunteering and they're involved in advocacy, and peer fundraising is really powerful, especially when I talk to my daughter and you see that and how that manifests. And they're very focused on community building, especially right now. So in other words, generosity has become relationship oriented and more participatory, not just about a $10 financial transaction.
I love that the spirit of the word generosity encompasses all of that better now in the conversations that we're having about support and what that looks like, and getting away from it simply being a metric around
a transaction,
ultimately, and that we can broaden that to encompass a lot of different things, which actually I think feeds conceptually abundance in a very
100%.
different way.
And if I can just add to that, if your orientation is just to the dollar transaction and not recognizing the importance of all those other forms of generosity, you're actually really undermining your long-term strategy. Because if you are meeting a supporter where they are, I think again about my daughter. She does a lot of volunteering, some advocacy, and that's what she's capable of doing right now. But 10 years from now, 5 years from now, whatever it might be, that can evolve into a stronger more loyal relationship that does involve a financial support, right? So yes, we see that there's a short-term focus, and I think the most important component of some of this is expanding that focus to recognize that there's a long game here too when
Yeah.
it comes to building relationships and cultivating them so that there's a financial benefit down the road.
That's true for us, even just as donors. We've been really highly invested in organizations and have shown up in lots of different ways with those organizations, and then have been reduced to just our transaction. That's the financial monetary transaction. And when that isn't valued, it feels like, oh, well, then we won't spend our time here. We won't, plan our estate giving to be here. We won't make our, volunteer contributions or give our resources of knowledge and information in our fundraising world. And that just like dramatically shifts how we show up for an organization. So I think it is always just so, I think, hopeful when I hear that younger generations are looking at and valuing how my time is valued, how my relationships are valued, and are giving as much to their friend who's fundraising for a cause as they are to like the cause itself. You mentioned peer-to-peer, and I think that's like we've seen a huge swell in peer-to-peer fundraising because of that direct
100%.
relationship.
I laugh sometimes. My daughter and some of her friends, they have pretty significant spheres of influence in terms of folks that they follow and that follow them on social platforms. I'm always kind of amazed at it, to be perfectly honest. And, they may not be in a point in their careers where they can afford to be a recurring donor, but they can offer other forms of support, whether it be volunteering or opening up their sphere of influence to the nonprofit through peer-to-peer and other advocacy type moments. So it's very interesting to kind of look at how the landscape is shifting and how generosity and the definition of that is taking on a much broader set of elements.
Yeah. How do you see, there are a bazillion communication methods now, right? Much more. I think when you were just talking about your dad and donating, and I think about the mechanisms that the nonprofit community was deploying then for that, probably hinging a lot around direct
check once a month,
direct mail, sort of monthly donor, that sort of piece. But now with sort of all of these communication channels happening that are working around fundraising in organizations, maybe not even directly linked, but they have a role in amplification of generosity. What are you seeing in terms of technology and communication and generosity, and how it's building a container for that to take shape in?
Sure. I actually think more channels and more options has expanded generosity rather than dilute it. I think some folks are of that mindset that it's actually been harmful. I don't see it that way. I think where the challenge comes in is, as a nonprofit, okay, we used to send out a mailer, an annual appeal. We get a bunch of checks and we process them. Okay, that's one channel. Now I've got to think about 5 or 6 channels, and my work as a program manager or whatever it might be at the nonprofit, I now have to, it's just gotten exponentially harder for me to think about our strategy and manage the outcomes. But I think, donors today experience a cause across all of these different touch points, and that can be, social, it can be email, it can be in person, it can be, websites, direct mail, and every interaction either builds or weakens the connection they feel with a nonprofit. It was interesting. We were looking at some data, and as an aside, I started my career working at a direct mail marketing agency. So whenever I hear about direct mail, my ears always perk up. The data point shows that Gen Z, Okay, so these are our youngest population. They are twice as likely as older generations, even boomers, to give right now via direct mail. It seems counterintuitive.
It's amazing.
And you ask the question, why? And it's not that Gen Z sort of prefers like old school channels. It's that in a crowded digital first world that they've grown up in, where they're being bombarded by digital messages all the time, the channels that actually feel more human and trustworthy and distinct, like direct mail, is actually having an outsized impact on fundraising with that generation. So it's really fascinating. That's an aside, but I find that fascinating.
I think it's fascinating and exciting because I'm like, here is a channel that organizations have been leveraging for a really long time, but it's become a narrower demographic. And now that demographic is opening back up, which I think is exciting.
Right?
Yeah.
I think what's most important is to for nonprofits to recognize that donors don't think in the context of channels.
Right.
They experience a single relationship in multiple ways. So it's no longer about it's not about a single ask or a transaction anymore. The relationships are built over time through sort of consistent, connected experiences across all these channels. Again, that can be a lot for a nonprofit to manage. But these multiple channels are really creating more opportunities, right, to meet people in the moment, meet them where they are, and when they're most open, right, to your message, whether it's through a powerful, impact story or a peer recommendation or something happening in real time. So more channels provide opportunity to make it more personal and more participatory and more relationship driven.
I hope folks take that to heart.
Yeah.
Because I think when we talk about segmenting our donors, we're actually segmenting a donor, right? Not just a pool of them. We're taking one individual donor and starting to segment them in ways that they don't see themselves. They see themselves in 3D.
Right. In relationship.
In relationship, moving 360 degrees, right? And so when we flatten them, when we carve part of them out, we're actually activating scarcity on them in a way that the idea of abundance is letting them be in full and us being in relationship to that in some ways, that I hope folks think about, instead of it being a chore, all of these channels and all of these ways to intersect with folks, that the abundance shift is that they're opportunities.
Yeah. It's interesting. Years ago, we had a development director we were working with, and she wasn't really leveraging social media. She was leveraging it as a communication outbound, but not as an information resource. And I said, well, are you following your donors? And she's like, oh, that feels very intrusive. And I'm like, so social media is a public platform where people are curating a story about themselves. How do you know the stories they're telling if you're not following their social media? And she did follow their social media, and she said that within a year, she saw her fundraising increase exponentially because she had the ability to say, how was vacation? How are the kids? And she just had more like connection points that they were already signaling. They were already putting out there. So I think like tech can be information out, it can be connection, it can be information in, but tech can also be a tool, right? It can be like how we can change how we do our work, especially with AI being integrated now into how we do our work. I'm curious, what role do you think technology is playing in helping nonprofits to really unlock generosity?
Yes, I think, it's playing a really important role, and the key is the right technology. Because when you have the right technology, it's going to take this abundance mindset, which we talked about is sort of a conscious choice to look at and think about things differently and open up your view of the circumstance in front of you. But what the technology does, it allows you to make that mindset actionable. And at a high level, it gives nonprofits something they've historically really struggled with. And you just touched on it. It's having and getting all of that insight and data in one place so they can have that complete view or visibility into their supporters, and be able to see them as a person, not just a transaction. And that's really, really important, because at the heart of all of this, when you kind of peel back the layers, it's all about relationships and stewarding those relationships and making those connections. You see that as an important component regardless of which generation you're looking at in the data. So it's really, really fundamental. And in order to do that, you really do need that sort of 360-degree view of an individual, and you need the technology and the tools to help you mine that so that you can communicate in a really intentional way. And what that does, it not only makes the mindset actionable, but it shifts fundraising from guesswork to actual impact, right?
Yeah.
So, instead of sending the same message to everyone, right? Nonprofits, can personalize the communication in a way that actually reflects the status of the relationship, acknowledging someone's history with the organization, their interests, their level of engagement, all those things. But equally important, the right technology also enables the execution or orchestration, right? It helps nonprofits show up consistently across channels. So as I was describing, okay, I went from one single channel and managing to all of these. If you have the right technology, that expansion of opportunity doesn't feel like a burden, because the technology is supporting you.
Yeah.
So whether someone is opening an email or seeing a social post or receiving a piece of mail, it feels like one cohesive experience. And that consistency is what builds trust, which is the foundation of any relationship, right? So the important piece is that the right technology helps identify opportunity. It can surface high potential supporters. It can highlight patterns in someone's giving behavior, and also, reveal moments where someone might be kind of pulling back and ready to deepen their involvement, right? So in having all that data, having a complete view of the supporter, gives you the ability to mine the information that you have and identify those opportunities that are going to lead to that growth and impact. So ultimately, the tech isn't about just efficiency, although that's part of it.
Yeah.
It's about impact and relevance. And when nonprofits can be relevant, be more relevant, they're able to not only build those deeper relationships, but that's what leads to then unlocking more generosity. That was a long answer to your question.
No,
but
it's
I
great.
hope that was all
It's
right.
great. Yeah.
Well, it's an interesting sort of conversation that happens in the nonprofit space so often, which is like good data, bad data, sort of what we're doing with our data. But I think there's a lot of different technology tools that have been rolling out over the past decade to the nonprofit sector. And I want to take just a second for my own personal plug about Bloomerang, because I think that as a tech tool, you also have a very friendly user interface, meaning that the organization who is looking for resource within their data can access it. It's user friendly in that people know how to enter the data and track. And so then now they have a tech tool that they're actually utilizing. And I think that that's one of the barriers sometimes we see in technology, is that there's really complicated tools and it's hard to use. And so there's not adoption. And when you think of abundance from a perspective of like, we have an abundance of data in the world right now. We're understanding data as a tool and a resource, but I think organizational shift into abundance also requires like team adoption. It requires that people are collectively supporting each other and looking for the celebrations, the wins, the gratitudes, and looking toward the opportunities and creative thinking. That also requires that in order to leverage your tech tools as a resource, that the tech tools are being adopted. And so I think having a tool that is user-friendly, that is easy for folks to adopt, that everyone can be looking at, is also a resource that I think is undervalued, in that sometimes going for the most complicated tool prevents user engagement. And then it's hard to get people on board with abundance because it just feels like task management. And so I really look to our own shifts that we've made as business owners, and looking toward abundance has really been that we're collectively all on board and supporting each other, that when we approach our workday from that to-do list instead of from the opportunities ahead, that we help to lift each other out of that. And so I think that sometimes how to make that shift also requires us to evaluate, what are the barriers that we can remove? And I think when we look to our tech tools, having tech tools that are user-friendly makes that adoption a lot easier.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. And I thank you for the compliment from a Bloomerang perspective. We always appreciate that. The team has always been very oriented to, as we've created and evolved the technology, really focusing on, what does the nonprofit need?
Yeah.
Versus building tech just for the sake of building tech. That's frankly one of the reasons that I'm at Bloomerang, because of that mentality and that customer first focus. So thank you for that. One thing I didn't mention, we can't have a conversation about tech without talking about AI at this stage, right?
Yeah.
I think the nonprofits, the organizations that are going to achieve that next level impact, right? As far as unlocking generosity and bringing that abundance mindset to the forefront of what they do, AI opens up a lot of possibilities.
Yeah.
You just you need to make sure that the AI is built into the platform that you're using, and it's adding value and not just scratching the surface. You want AI tools and resources that are really going to look deep at your data, not general information out on the web, but really look at your data and help you and identify for you those opportunities for abundance. And with the right platform and the right tools, you can achieve pretty outsized results. If you don't know, Bloomerang has a AI partner for our customers called Penny that is in beta right now, and we're pretty excited about the impact she will have on our nonprofit customers and their ability to kind of take this to the next level. So check her out.
That's great.
There's actually opportunities to meet Penny. So if you want to learn more, you can actually sign up for a webinar to meet Penny.
That's awesome. So I feel like perfecting and tailoring your tech stack with this as an intention is sort of the implementation phase of this. But if I'm sitting here as a frontline fundraiser in an organization, and I'm thinking about and starting to understand conceptually the idea of generosity, and now I'm trying to figure out what the heck that looks like in practice in my organization, and there's a gulf there sometimes that feels insurmountable, and that actually probably feeds the scarcity piece.
Exactly.
How can organizations, before we get to the point of being able to drill down on a tech stack that's supporting that, how do we close that gap to be able to make those decisions? How do we create some of that shift?
Yes, 100%. And I think fundamental to being able to make that shift successfully is making sure you have all your data in one place. And I think you touched on this earlier as well. Without that complete view, it just makes all the rest of this harder to achieve. So that's one thing. But I think also closing the gap really comes down to, turning that mindset into actual behaviors, right? It starts with shifting from a transactional to a relationship-focused mindset. Generosity doesn't come from a one-time ask anymore. It grows from that, continued connection where supporters feel seen and valued and part of something bigger, right?
Yep.
I think organizations have to expand how they define generosity. It's not just about dollars, like we talked about. And when they recognize and nurture those other forms of engagement, that financial giving often follows. And I think, third point, it's about building the trust through consistency, that clear communication, that transparency, that showing impact over time. And I think finally, using the data to guide strategy and action. It's not just about collecting the data, but actually using it to understand your supporters and respond in those more relevant and personal ways. So, when you put that all together, closing the gap isn't about actually doing more. It's about just being more intentional in how you build relationships and respond to the people who are already there wanting to support your mission.
Yeah, and I think that's a critical distinction for fundraisers who are like, I'm sorry, you want me to do how much more with how much less, right? And which just feeds the other part of the other side of the coin. That I think it's, what if you could expend the same amount of energy but make it deliberate?
Yeah.
And have it be strategic in terms of where you're headed versus reactionary. It could be the same amount of effort, but with that shift, you're building towards something versus turning in a circle. Yeah.
So what does it look like when you have an organization that's really adopting abundance and thriving?
I think a thriving organization right now has made that fundamental shift in how they view the world. I think at its core, it's an organization that has made the shift from scarcity to possibility, and they truly believe that generosity hasn't disappeared. They recognize that it's simply evolving. And those organizations that have made that shift, you can see it in how they operate. They're deeply focused on relationships, not just the revenue, which is super important. I'm not downplaying that, but they recognize the importance of cultivating relationships. They understand their supporters as people, not segments, right? And they show up consistently across, every interaction with purpose. They're also adaptive. They're willing to experiment, to try new things, to meet donors where they are, to test, and to evolve how they engage as supporter behavior changes. They're tuned in and they're able to adapt, and they have a level of curiosity and responsiveness that as a supporter you can feel. And I think, I don't want to say this is most important, but it's certainly critical. They're connected internally, right? Not enough for one person to kind of say, okay, we're not going to think in terms of scarcity constructs anymore. It's about abundance. There's generosity. Let's go get it. If you haven't, as a team, made that shift, then it's going to be really, really hard to bring people along. So their teams, their data, their strategy, everything is rowing in the same direction. They're all aligned. So the experiences they create externally feel intentional. And, maybe most of all, thriving organization is one that is confident in its role. It doesn't operate from a perspective of fear or competition, and it operates believing that there is more generosity to unlock, and that our job is to build the trust and connection and relevance that will invite people into that. Because when nonprofits believe more is possible, they discover something really powerful, that generosity is right there. It's within reach.
And this is a mission-based sector.
Right.
And sometimes I just want us to dream.
Yeah.
We all are operating from a place of a mission that is trying to make the world better than we found it. And with that as a guiding principle, generosity and abundance feel like they should be intrinsic to what we're doing. And so I think reminding folks of the promise and the purpose
Well, as a donor,
Yeah.
I want to be on board with the organization that believes more is possible.
You bet.
I love the confident in your role, because I think that so often organizations have these beautiful missions, but do feel like they're in competition with another organization that has a similar overlapping mission. And I just love that when we collaborate, when we are confident in our role, that so much more is possible. It gives me a lot of hope in this changing
100%,
time.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to ask Mary to step into the fundraising elevator. So we'll be right back.
Change. It doesn't happen on its own. It happens on purpose. Thanks to nonprofits that believe a brighter future is not just possible, but needed and deserved, and that connect people to causes and turn moments of generosity into movements. That's why Bloomerang is built for purpose, to raise the bar on what's possible and help every act of giving lead to more. Because when the bottom line is a better world, no goal is too lofty. Bloomerang, built for purpose.
Welcome back. We are talking about abundance and generosity and all of the good sides of things. It's time to jump in the fundraising elevator. Mary, this is where we all head up. What is your parting wisdom or thought for fundraisers out there who also want to continue heading up?
Okay. I would say this, don't let a scarcity narrative shape how you show up, either you or your organization. Because the organizations that are going to keep moving forward, moving upward. I love the fundraising elevator metaphor, by the way. The ones that are going to keep moving up right now are the ones that choose to believe that more is possible. And then they act on it and they act like it. The other piece I'd share is pay attention to what the data, your data, is actually telling you. Not just the headlines. The headlines often say generosity is declining, but when you look closer, when you look at your own data, you see that people still want to give. They just want to give differently. So try to shut out some of that noise and focus on what your data is telling you. Again, it's really important. All your data in one place allows you to get that really clear picture. So the opportunity isn't to chase what used to work. It's about leaning into how generosity is evolving. And if you do that, if you stay curious, you focus on relationships, and you stay open to possibility, you don't just keep up with change. You actually unlock more generosity on the other side of it. And that's where the magic happens.
I love that.
So good.
We're all headed up. Well, I want to make sure to take a moment for folks. If they want to learn more about Bloomerang, there's a couple of opportunities coming up, and we're going to provide some links in the show notes. There is the opportunity to meet Penny on a webinar. There's the opportunity always to sign up for a demo and learn about Bloomerang. But can you tell us a little bit about GiveCon coming up May 17th through the 20th in St. Louis? This is your big annual conference, right?
It is. We're really excited for it. GiveCon is, it's an immersive learning experience, and it's designed to really transform how your organization connects and grows and gives, and you'll learn actionable strategies to boost fundraising and elevate donor engagement and retention and unlock new efficiencies through donor journey automation, and make abundance actionable. So you can visit our site, bloomerang.com/givecon, to learn more. And we would love to see your audience there.
Amazing. Well, if you are ready to embrace abundance and learn all about how to make it actionable, I hope to see you. I will be at GiveCon. We're very excited to be able to have a podcast coming from GiveCon as well. So, Mary, thank you for joining us. I hope our guests will check out GiveCon. I hope we'll see some of our guests there, and I will definitely see you there. So we appreciate you being on the show today and to inspire all of us and all of our listeners to lean into abundance.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. I loved being with you today, and I'll look forward to seeing you in May.
All right. We'll see you there. Thank you.
Take care.
The Fundraising Elevator is produced by Swaim Strategies at the studios of the AV department. The program is produced and directed by Steve Osborne, with audio engineering and original music by Dwayne Anderson and Heidi Christensen. Video production by John Collier. Graphic design by Pendulum Creative Group. And voiceover by Josh Boykin.
Friends, before we leave you, we want to ask for your help to make the podcast grow. If you enjoyed what you heard today, please like, follow, subscribe to the Fundraising Elevator. And if you're getting a lot out of the show, please share it with a friend and leave a review. These things help make sure that the podcast continues heading up. Thank you so much for tuning in.
Are you ready to engage supporters and grow your base with your own podcast? Then let us introduce you to our partners at the AV department in Portland, Oregon. In addition to delivering exceptional live event audiovisual production and videography, they also have a top-tier production studio and an expert team ready to take your content ideas to the next level. Contact the AV department to schedule a consultation and start bringing your podcast vision to life.